Most men don't know how to receive love, and most of them don't even realize that they have this problem. And maybe it's because on the outside it doesn't look like you have a problem. You're still functioning, you're providing, and you're showing up. But underneath all of that, there's this subtle resistance behind being cared for. And if you don't understand it, you'll spend your entire life chasing connection, but quietly pushing it away, pushing it aside. And if we haven't met yet, my name is Nick Von Pitt. I work with founders, leaders, and high performers. People are doing well on the outside, but internally they find themselves struggling. And one of the biggest things that I've noticed, particularly within men, is this difficulty in receiving love. Men try to be very pragmatic about this because they are wanting to fix this through strategy, that be it better communication or effort or intention. But that's not where this lives. It lives in your identity. It lives within your nervous system. It lives in what you learned love was before you had language for it. And that's what makes this such a rich place to start. The inability to receive love or allowing yourself to receive love, it affects you on a personal level. It affects your relationships. It affects your business. It affects how you lead all other things, including yourself. So today we're going to dive into what this looks like and where where to start when you start asking, well, what is love? What does it mean to me? Why do I struggle in receiving this? And the intention is for you to sit there and find a space where this becomes a conversation and an exploratory vehicle for you where you can make sense of this. And for me, it started early. I grew up always seeking approval and validation. I was competitive, I achieved fairly well, I pushed, and I never really felt seen and heard. There was always a comparison. And when you don't necessarily get this external validation for the things that you're doing, you're not meeting certain expectations, you begin to believe that love isn't something you necessarily receive by just being who and what you are. That it is essentially something that you earn. It becomes a function of your existence. And you find that you struggle to open up, you question it, you try to manage these moments of openness and vulnerability, or you end up shutting it down because it feels so overwhelming when it is in your vicinity, versus this softening or a space where I am able to let go of this mask or this bravado or this armor that I have to carry into my day. Well, I found that I struggled to soften into connection, and there was more of a brace and an expectation that if I didn't do anything right, or if I didn't tick certain boxes, or if I opened up too much, it's going to be taken away. And I don't want it to be taken away because this is what I've been pursuing. So just to dive a little bit deeper, essentially when love or care was offered, it didn't feel safe. And I felt like I had to perform or achieve outwardly to earn it, which led me to becoming a high performing workaholic. So physiologically speaking, my brain would automatically tune out. And as a defensive response to stress, I would do that more often than not. When I felt inadequate or overwhelmed in relationships, and I think that was something that I only picked up as I got older and moved through my teens into my 20s. My immediate reaction was to pull away. It was to posture, put myself in a position where I could intimidate and feel bigger than I was, and utilize manipulative withdrawal, saying things like, "You guys would be better without me," or "Don't worry about me. It's okay. Like you do this," or whatever the case may be. And I realized that in those moments, I was essentially protecting myself. I did not want to experience the excruciating discomfort of vulnerability and not feeling good enough, and more importantly, losing connection. So, what I found is that you don't necessarily learn how to relax into love, you learn how to manage it. And when someone shows up for you, you don't necessarily soften, you end up assessing, you feel the pressure to perform continuously. And Instead of receiving, you start managing the moment. And just notice, take a moment for a second and just notice if you're managing love or receiving love. And you'll see that the internal questioning changes on both. And I find that most men are sitting in the managing section because, well, it's a thing where when men are shown love or presented with the opportunity for emotional closeness, they often lack the soft skills to navigate it. So that's something that you weren't taught, you weren't trained. It's got nothing to do with you with in terms of your identity. It's just a behavior. And rather than leaning in, they'll either subtly or they'll overtly withdraw, shut down, or become defensive. So in conversations, that shows up as stonewalling, tuning out, turning away, and acting busy or engaging in obsessive behaviors, which could come through as addiction, porn, or other outlets. So, in facing vague emotional requests like your partner saying we're lacking intimacy, men often feel confused and paralyzed because they don't know what specific action to take. And then there's this recurring pattern across men, which is living in denial. Their actions reflect a deep emotional isolation. And ultimately, they're afraid that by opening up or showing a sense of vulnerability, they'll be perceived as weak. And they fear that they'll essentially have the shit beaten out of them emotionally. And it's something that is, I found that is very true and very, very real for men because the minute you are exposing that part of yourself, there's nothing that is able to protect you other than you withdrawing or going through those same patterns and avoiding that emotional openness entirely. In a typical male upbringing, boys are taught from an early age not to feel. Don't cry, be a man. A phrase that I think so many men have heard for decades. And don't be so emotional. When a boy is told to be a man, his natural emotions like sadness or fear are invalidated. And as you'll see here, they don't learn to lean in, they end up withdrawing. And men don't lack the desire for connection, they lack the capacity for it because it's a skill that is not being taught. And or teaching them that their emotions are wrong and men cannot trust what they feel. This ends up creating a tragic conflict between authenticity, feeling those true emotional expressions, and attachment, the need of being loved and accepted by your caregiver. Think of a little boy that is trying to circumnavigate this. He's obviously going to choose safety and survival. Vulnerability ends up being framed as not as a human need, but rather as weakness to be punished. And you'll see here, like this is the typical ways in which you would withdraw, pulling away, shutting down, distraction, or irritability. And those are the symptoms that arise when there's just a desire for connection underneath all of that. And here's something that stands out for me. I find that love and an acceptance were often conditioned on emotional control mechanisms. So there had to be performance, there had to be toughness, and then there's this core belief that ends up being instilled early on, which is one must suppress themselves to be acceptable. So, next we dive into if a man cannot receive love, he forms an identity completely based on performance and providing. And we hear this as the standard male archetype. A man must perform, and must provide, and these are the expectations and what it means to be a man. And what ends up happening is you end up adhering to societal male norms that dictate that you must do it in this specific way. And he sees himself just as the provider and as a problem solver, but not as someone who's allowed to be cared for, not as someone who is a part of the family. And I cannot tell you how many times I've heard this just from men who are sitting there and just saying, listen, I feel like I'm looking at my life from the outside in. I feel like I'm looking at my family and I'm standing outside of this house and I'm peering through the window. I can see all this love and I can see, but I don't know what to do with it. Where do I go with that? And there's an internal narrative that ends up being driven by shame, which tells him I'm a mistake or I'm bad. And rather than men looking at that and saying, look, I'm also allowed to experience that, they internalize that and becomes very, very shameful. So you've got this little boy who wants to express emotion or suppress emotion. And the one threatens attachment, the other one secures the attachment. And then there's obviously the result, which is rejection, and the other one, which will ideally result in you staying connected. And it is an impossible choice. It is something that one cannot just decide and say, this, I'm going to express myself. And the minute you start doing that, you ended up being labeled as the black sheep, or you're too much. So you end up choosing to essentially perform to survive. And I find that this is when there's a very clear lone wolf archetype that is developed, where instead of receiving love, he ends up blocking it off. And or men would rather rely on a false sense of stoicism and independence to essentially mask these emotional wounds. So you've got this mask that ends up becoming who you think you are. And underneath that, there's this shame, there's this embarrassment or underlying sense of failure or perception that he cannot fix himself. And this will come up as, I cannot fix my relationship, I cannot fix how I'm fathering, I cannot fix myself, I'm struggling with this idea of being worthy and being able to receive care, love, and respect. And so this continues, where this phrase comes up time and time again. I'm valuable because of what I do, not because of who I am. And there is a massive gap between your behavior and your identity. And you believe that you are what you do. You're not who you are. In so many homes, so many businesses are being fueled by this pattern and by this belief. You look at the setup behind this, which is, if love had to be earned, then your identity becomes performance. You then move into your roles, which is the problem solver, provider, the one who has to hold everything together. And then rejection, but you don't see yourself as a person. You actually end up burning out because of this internal narrative that is based on shame of, I'm bad, or if I made a mistake, or I'm never good enough, or you keep on chasing this mark to find more validation, to be seen by these external people and caregivers that no longer necessarily have the front row seat to your life, because you're not that little boy, but you're functioning from that space. The result is, when love is offered, when care is offered, it doesn't match your identity. So that lone wolf and independence, it's still very much alive. And you mask with that. I don't need that. But underneath that, you're yearning for that, because this is a basic human need. And so now we look at the nervous system, which physiologically, emotional closeness can trigger a state of flooding in a man's nervous system. Instead of relaxing into love, his autonomic nervous system essentially just ramps up, and it releases stress hormones and triggering the fight, flight, or freeze response. Your safety feels unsafe because his nervous system was never essentially programmed to navigate that sense of safety when he was a child. So what happens is, he ends up associating that safety with vulnerability, and vulnerability is associated with danger and abandonment. So as a result, his body literally shrinks and tightens. And you can actually see this. You've got this, the minute there's emotional closeness that comes into place, this is what you sit and experience. It is a lived and felt expression of this pattern. And it is so frustrating because it's so easy to just tune out and switch off. And it's because you haven't been able to regulate. This is actually what's happening when intimacy is being introduced into my space or connection. And what actually comes up is emotional unpredictability. You actually don't know what's going to happen next. You've got that younger part of you saying, "Ooh, I'm trying to survive this physiological overwhelm." And what you'll find is his brain ends up resorting to tuning out or going numb or disconnecting himself from that gut feeling and essentially his body. So it's complete dissociation that ends up taking place. Your body is choosing this itself. So now this is where it becomes quite problematic. And we now start looking at the behavior and how you end up sabotaging connection in your relationships, in your connection with people, your partner, your kids, even in business. Practically, this nervous system overwhelm manifests as stonewalling. This is a behavior in men who withdraw emotionally from conflict. And 85% of stonewallers are men. So you'll find that he will continuously test love in some way, shape, or form. So there's a be it a daily bid for connection, there'll be stonewalling, chilling out, distance created, perceived emotional attack. If you look at the Four Horsemen by the Gottman Institute, really interesting work. You're looking at defensiveness, criticism, sarcasm. Conflict escalates. Again, it results in distance and internal discomfort and vulnerability, numbing, overworking, scrolling, addiction. So the things where you're creating separation. You'll find that men tend to distract themselves by overworking, scrolling, relying on these addictions, be it pornography, as a way to numb themselves from this discomfort, because they actually do not know what to do with those feelings. They don't know how to label the feelings, don't know how to necessarily express those feelings. And if feelings are bad, that's the thing that I just want you to take away from that, which is you've associated that all your feelings are just not okay to have or express. So when a man cannot receive love or emotionally be present, what happens in your relationships? Intimacy goes down, desire essentially erodes, and you end up with a one-way ticket to roommate syndrome, where couples essentially coexist without any physical or emotional closeness. And communication breaks down. The partner is stonewalling. So let's look at this erosion loop that actually then ends up taking place within the relationship. So man feels flooded and is unavailable inside. Man stonewalls, withdraws to self-protect. Partner experiences distance and confusion and anxiety. Partner then pursues the issue harder to regain connection. Man feels overwhelmed and flooded. This is just the experience that your partner goes through. How long and sustainable do you think that is for a partner to circumnavigate? How long is this process sustainable? It's not. At some point, this person is going to give up. They're going to have to put this idea of a relationship down and say, I cannot avail myself to someone who is emotionally unavailable. And it's funny because you're not the the person who is stonewalling understands that they are doing it, but it feels like they're just stuck and they don't know what to do about it. They don't think anything's wrong. And then it's that whole thing of, but look what I'm doing. Look, I've ticked these boxes. I'm doing all the things that you've asked, but they don't feel your presence, my friend. That is what many people do not get, is the presence is not felt and it is not seen. This ties deeply into your relationships and ties into your business. A man's inability to receive love and to be vulnerable directly impacts his professional life and leadership. It's because vulnerability is the birthplace of innovation, creativity, and adaptability. If you are not vulnerable, you are unable to tap into that intuitive space. And yes, there's this idea of you can be hard on when you're stepping into business and you're out there in the world and you are chasing down your prey, but you can be soft at home. Great if you can do that and you can balance that, but you still have access to vulnerability. And there's still a human underneath that is allowed to express and feel. So there's this defensive posture that makes it incredibly difficult for men to accept influence or constructive feedback, be it through a partner, be it through a a personal relationship, or it could even be through therapy and coaching. This I've seen it time and time and again. There's this defensiveness that comes up, and men then often isolate themselves in work, performing at a high level and putting on this massive show of success while internally feeling disconnected, depressed, and anxious, and they just cannot escape that. It's because they again are avoiding their emotions. And you can see it. There's this continuous deflection, deflecting intimacy, deflecting support, inability to receive love, inability to receive feedback and guidance or help. Now I'll do it on my own. Micromanagement, burnout, all these things that we are pouring ourselves into is just because we are asking for love and connection. And we are trying to figure out, how do we receive this? And it happens more often than not that men lean into this lone wolf myth and ends up cutting himself off of the social connection and collaborative support that is available. So that could be your family, that could be your friends, that would be the support system at work or your colleagues. And all this leads to is just a life that looks amazing on the outside, but internally it feels empty. And I like to call it the void that we avoid. So underneath all of this, underneath the man that is stonewalling, that is high performing, that is lone wolfing, that is psychologically flooding, is this one single belief. And that belief is, I have to earn my place. So for man to safely receive love, he must connect to his own body and emotions. And it is a journey, it is a practice. So there's a practice that was brought forward by Dr. Gabor Mate, which is called compassionate inquiry, looking at those defensive behaviors like withdrawing or anger, not with necessarily shame, but recognizing them as he puts it, stupid friends, um, coping mechanisms that have essentially kept you safe in childhood and they are no longer serving. So that's probably one of the biggest steps, is just becoming friends with those parts of yourself and just looking at it. Because everything starts with awareness. When you can actually see this and be like, oh goodness, that's a starting point. You're just seeing it and actually observing it. Then there's another step, and this is a courageous step. This is the ability to adopt a stance around being imperfect and replace the script of never being good enough with the core belief that I am always enough, or I am enough. And this is a very simple depiction of what it could look like, starting with safety in the body. So, in compassionate inquiry, moving into replacing that script. And then lastly, just allowing care. And you're not having to, it's a conscious thing where you're not having to turn that care into pressure. And this is the shift. Receiving love is not passive, it's something you build, it's not something you fake. And it is felt, it is lived, it is a natural expression of being open, being vulnerable, and being you, most importantly. So if you can't receive love, you will spend your life performing for it. You'll build businesses, you will carry responsibilities, you'll do everything right on paper. And society will also validate all the above. But internally, you will feel it. You cannot avoid that feeling that you are sitting with right now in this moment. Because the goal isn't to just build a life, it is the ability to actually live in it. Thank you for taking the time to dive into yourself and to really take a look under the hood. And if you want to dive a bit deeper, I've got a capacity assessment where you can see where you're leaking energy, where you're lacking capacity. And as you mentioned before, your capacity is directly correlated to your nervous system. And if your nervous system is unable to function optimally, well, this is one of the symptoms. And if you want to dive even deeper, well, there's ways to apply, to connect, and to continue the conversation. And as always, you have the ability to make the shift. Catch you soon.